Good evening and welcome. I'm Michael Kessler, the Executive Director of the Berkeley Center and a faculty member in the Government Department. Welcome to this evening's event, Christian Nationalism and the Borders of Political Community, with Brad Anishi and Yonat Shimron. Yonat is in traffic, is supposed to be here in a few minutes, so she'll join us. But given the time duration of this event, we wanted to get started, and she'll be joining here momentarily. We're delighted at the Berkeley Center to host this event alongside our partner organization, the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting. The Pulitzer Center is a nonprofit journalism organization that supports independent international journalism and promotes in-depth engagement with global affairs through its sponsorship of quality international journalism across all media platforms. This event is funded through a generous grant by the Luce Foundation. I wish to thank especially Holly Rosewood, Ann Peters, and Kem Sawyer from the Pulitzer Center, and my colleague Ryan Craig for their leadership in this event. Today's discussion promises to be fascinating and critical exploration of immigration and national belonging in the context of U.S. Christian nationalism. I'm delighted to introduce my old friend, Jerome Kopulski, who will moderate tonight's discussion. Jerome is a graduate of the University of Chicago, where I met him. He's a research fellow at the Berkeley Center. He co-directed Uncivil Religion, January 6, 2021, which was a digital resource created through a collaboration between Smithsonian's National Museum of American History and the University of Alabama's Department of Religious Studies. Jerome's book on the tensions of religion and politics in the United States, called American Heretics, will soon be published by Yale University Press. Welcome, Jerome. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you all for coming out this evening to what promises to be a really engaging and illuminating conversation. I'm really thrilled to be a part of this project with the Berkeley Center, and it's a kind of fruition of a lot of work and conversations I've had with Michael over, I don't want to say how many years, but more than a few years. So I don't think it's hyperbole to say that the question of belonging, who is and who ought to be part of the political community, lies at the very heart of our current national conversation, or maybe more accurately, our ongoing national argument. And religious actors have been some of the most prominent voices on all sides of this debate over who is or who can be a true American. In recent months, recent years, the term Christian nationalism has been deployed to describe one party or set of parties in this conflict. And in brief, those who could be identified as Christian nationalists, or those who self-identify as such, could be defined as those people who believe that the United States was founded explicitly as a Christian nation, and it ought to remain, or it ought to be restored as such, and that only those who profess Christianity, or rather a certain form of Christianity, are to be regarded as authentic Americans. It follows then that those who subscribe to Christian nationalism find themselves in deep tension with the realities of American pluralism and the liberal democratic values that allow for people with deep differences to live together in relative concord. Our purpose this evening is to consider how Christian nationalism shapes our contemporary controversies regarding immigration and the treatment of migrants and refugees and those who are considered to be other to the national community. And I'm privileged to introduce our conversation partners this evening, two of the most prominent voices on the state of religion in contemporary America. First, Dr. Bradley Onishi is faculty at the University of San Francisco. He is author most recently of Preparing for War, The Extremist History of White Christian Nationalism and What Comes Next, as well as numerous other works. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, NBC News, HuffPost, among many other outlets. And he's the co-host and producer of the podcast Straight White American Jesus. Soon to be joining us will be Yonat Shimron, national reporter and senior editor at Religion News Service, where she writes on a variety of issues, including Judaism and evangelicals in the South. She was the religion reporter for the News and Observer in Raleigh, North Carolina, from 1996 to 2011, and she is past president of the Religion News Association. Yonat received a master's in journalism from Columbia University. She's a native of Israel and now lives in Durham, North Carolina. And most recently, she's part of a team of RNS reporters that has been investigating Christian nationalism. So I'd like to welcome our panelists to the event. Let me tell you a little bit about our game plan. Brad and Yonat are each going to present some brief opening remarks on the subject of tonight's event based on their own research and experience. And then we're going to engage the three of us in a bit of conversation to maybe sort of delve a little bit deeper on these themes and problems. And finally, in the last 10 or 15 minutes of our event, we'll turn to the audience for your questions. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Brad.
Want to thank you all for being here, and want to thank Jerome for that wonderful introduction, and Ryan and Holly and Imogene and the others who helped to make tonight happen. Thankful to see old friends and new faces, and just want to talk here for a minute about belonging, about the imagined American body, and how that affects how Christian nationalists, specifically white Christian nationalists, think about what it means to be part of this country. So there's a recent PRRI survey that appeared in February of this year, and here's what it says. Americans who are supportive of Christian nationalism generally hold less favorable views of immigrants. Among Americans overall, only 32% affirm the core tenet of so-called replacement theory. So Only's doing a lot of work there, but 32% of Americans support some tenet of replacement theory, the belief that immigrants are invading our country and replacing our cultural and ethnic background, while 67% disagree. However, 57% of Christian nationalism sympathizers and 71% of adherents agree with this assertion of replacement theory. Among Christian nationalist sympathizers and adherents who are white, belief in replacement theory rises to 66% and 81% respectively. So it about doubles from the general population. By margin of nearly 2 to 1, Americans believe that the growing number of newcomers from other countries strengthens American society. However, solid majorities of Christian nationalism sympathizers and adherents disagree that immigrants strengthen the country. Among Christian nationalism sympathizers and adherents who are white, disagreement rises to 64 and 72% respectively. So in a very sort of brief moment I have here, I'll just conclude and say that those who are white Christian nationalists in the country, who believe that Christianity should be privileged in the public square, who believe in the kind of founding that Jerome referenced, have a view of immigrants and immigration that is different from Americans generally speaking, and is in some cases, in any case I shall say, somewhat alarming. I want to just provide a brief theoretical kind of view on this, and then leave it for discussion and questions. My colleague and podcast co-host Dan Miller has a book called Queer Democracy, Desire, Dysphoria, and the Body Politic. And in that book, Miller argues that for millennia, the body has been a metaphor for how people, groups, and nations have envisioned their collective character and virtues. In other words, most countries and communities imagine their collective self as looking a certain way. The nation as body metaphor is centuries old, but what Dan argues, and what I would argue as well, and I do so in my book, Christian nationalists envision the American social body as straight, white, Christian, native-born, and patriarchal. When white Christian nationalists imagine the, quote, real American, they think of John Wayne or Donald Trump or Nancy Reagan, a woman who abides by patriarchal norms. They do not imagine Barack Obama or Kamala Harris or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, much less a trans teenager of color or a queer immigrant. Their model American looks a certain way and has a certain body. Its phenotype, sexuality, gender, and religious practice are rolled into a singular vision of the American anatomy. American Christian nationalism therefore expresses a desire for a return to a mythologized social and political order, Miller writes. In other words, white Christian nationalists want to reimpose on the nation a hierarchy in which real Americans occupy positions of social and political authority, while all others are merely nominal. It's not that people of color and immigrants aren't allowed here, it's just that they need to know their place in the American corpus. To extend the body metaphor, they are subordinate members who take orders from the central nervous system, frontal cortex, and other executive organs and parts. If they try to topple this order and become a central part of the American physique, or worse, become the commander-in-chief of its armed forces like Obama did when he was elected president, the white Christian nationalists will view the American body as out of whack. It will feel like something is wrong, as if there is a sickness plaguing the national body.
Is it okay if I...
Within the white Christian nationalist imagination, pluralism and multiculturalism, and the expansion of representation in civil rights and minoritized groups, writes Miller, are monstrous and grotesque. For white Christian nationalists, gains made by historically excluded constituencies don't represent the expansion of freedom, but the ruining of the American body. Their goal becomes reshaping society into the model they feel is right. Christian nationalism, represents a socially dysphoric effort to preserve or reinstate real Americans atop the American national hierarchy. Viewing themselves as the real Americans, then, white Christian nationalists feel entitled to occupy the top of the social order and political hierarchies. They see it as natural that white Christians would maintain power up and down the political and social systems. So, just to conclude, what I would say is that the body metaphor really helps us understand why, in so many cases, the feeling that immigrants and newcomers to the country, including refugees, are seen as invaders, are seen as pollutants, are seen as somehow corrupting American society. And what I would like to sort of introduce to the conversation as we get going tonight is that feeling and affect are really important here. Oftentimes, and I'll just admit, as I get older, I wake up in the morning and my knee hurts or my neck is sore, and I have to ask myself, did I go rock climbing yesterday? No. Did I play basketball? Nope. I'm just in my 40s and that's what happens. Here's the point. Sometimes our bodies hurt in ways that we don't always have a reason for at the moment. The reasons come post facto. We have to kind of seek them out. And sometimes the reasons we give aren't evidence-based, right? Well, if you think about the national social body, and if you have an understanding of that body as being white, Christian, abiding by patriarchal norms, and speaking English as a first language with no accent, well, sometimes it feels as if your country has been invaded or polluted or is out of whack, even though you don't actually have good reasons to explain why it feels that way, and you have to come up with those post facto. And so I'll introduce that, I'll leave it there, and allow us to continue the conversation.
Great, thank you. And now let me introduce to you, at long last, Yonat Shimron, who will be joining us.
I'm so sorry I'm late.
This is sort of the wages of DC rush hour traffic, so it's completely understandable, and we're glad that you're here. And I've already introduced you to the audience.
Oh.
So without further ado, if you want to take a moment.
Thank you. So thank you for inviting me to the Pulitzer Center. As you've heard, I'm a reporter for Religion News Service and have been studying Christian nationalism and writing about it a little bit. I'm sure Bradley has already explained or defined Christian nationalism to some extent. I'll start with a definition and I'll share a little bit more. According to sociologists Samuel Perry and Andrew Whitehead, Christian nationalism is a kind of creed that advocates for a fusion of American civic life with a particular Christian identity. It's a kind of muscular articulation of America that's led by white Christian men. And what I'd like to say is that Christian nationalism is not new. It's been around for a very long time. Christian evangelicals, a wide group that includes Baptists, non-denominational Christians, Pentecostals, and charismatics, have for centuries held the view that America was founded as a Christian nation. you can find this belief stretching back to the Puritan Christians who came to this country in the 1700s. These Christians believed that America was singled out by God to fulfill God's promise. It's a retelling of the biblical story in the Hebrew Bible where God singles out Israel as the new promised land. In this retelling, America is the promised land and Christianity is the faith that the founding fathers established here in this new nation. It's a story, and some would say a myth, of how the country was created, and it's been part of evangelical beliefs for a long time. Sometimes it's finessed. Some evangelicals will agree that as a matter of law, America is in fact a secular nation with no officially sanctioned church, but they still want to see Christianity privileged in public life, propped up by the active support of government at all levels. Others are willing to jettison any notion of church-state separation. And, you know, we saw this most clearly on January 6, where a mob of Christian nationalists invoking God attacked the US Capitol, claiming that the election was stolen from Donald Trump. The ubiquity of the Christian rituals there sent alarm bells to many journalists. There were the signs saying Jesus saves and Trump leads. Thank God for Trump. Jesus is king, Trump is president. You've probably seen a lot of those. This was kind of new, and it was the impetus, I think, for a lot of journalists, including journalists at Religion News Service, to pay closer attention to Christian nationalism and to white Christian nationalism in particular. What's new here is that there was a willingness on the part of white Christian nationalists to believe that defending and preserving a white and Christian America may require overturning the rule of law and, if needed, resorting to violence. That view has now taken hold in established Republican Party circles, where election denial and conspiracy theories continue to live on. In the 2022 midterms, we saw that while election denial may not have helped new GOP candidates, such as Doug Mastriani or Kari Lake, who both lost their elections, it didn't hurt Republican incumbents like Marjorie Taylor Greene, Lauren Boebert, Ron DeSantis. So how big is this problem? How many Christian nationalists are there? I wrote a survey about a new PRRI survey that was published last month that found that about a third of Americans can be identified as Christian nationalists. The exact percentage in the PRRI survey was 29%. Of that 29%, 10% are kind of avowed Christian nationalists, and 19% are kind of sympathetic to the Christian nationalist ideals. I think these numbers are fairly accurate. There was another study by Andrew Whitehead and Sam Perry, who I mentioned earlier, that found that about 20% of Americans strongly embrace Christian nationalist ideas. Whatever the number, whether it's 20% or 29%, it's clear that most Americans reject this view, that America is a Christian nation and that the myth-making that goes with it. The problem is that the Christian nationalists have a kind of outsized influence in American politics. More than half of Republicans now identify as Christian nationalists or sympathizers, this PRRI study found, and they have far more favorable views of Trump than the general population. So that makes the political power of Christian nationalists far greater than their actual numbers in the population. And the problem is that the beliefs of Christian nationalists are strongly associated with racism, sexism, homophobia. White Christian nationalists are, as you've heard Bradley say, anti-immigrant. They prize traditional marriage, where men lead and women follow. They oppose same-sex marriage and transgender rights. They oppose the Black Lives Matter movement. They believe that Black Americans deserve the violence that's inflicted on them by police. They deserve or that the inequality of Black Americans is due to their own shortcomings. And so they have this sense of persecution and resentment. They believe that America is in the grip of kind of malevolent forces, whether it's secularists, socialists, wokeism, a homosexual agenda, and they insist that it's their job to take America back. And I want to be clear also that, a very substantial number of Christian nationalists, they don't explicitly support a theocracy, but a lot of it is more about identity rather than policy. They may not be aiming for major fundamental changes in the way American government is organized, but they're making a statement about who they are and the kind of rapid change that they find frightening in this country. And so in North Carolina, where I live, I recently wrote a story about a group that works to get pastors elected to office. The American Renewal Project is one of a closely interconnected network of Christian nationalist policy and advocacy groups that are pushing this ideology. The American Renewal Project wants to recruit Christian pastors to run for office at the local, at the state, at the national level. In this past year, it held 19 luncheon gatherings for pastors across North Carolina, drawing some 1,500 local pastors. And they promised that these pastors, that if they run for office, the state's Republican Party will provide all the logistical support that they need to get elected. And this group believes that, Jesus wants Christians to have influence in the public square, and that the only way to restore Christianity to its rightful place in society is if more pastors run for office. It was modestly successful in 2022 in the midterms. 3 evangelical pastors were elected to North Carolina's General Assembly, and now they're on to other states like Missouri and Texas. And this story, as well as several others, were written thanks to a grant from the Pulitzer Center. And we're continuing now to investigate this and to write more about Christian nationalism. There are all kinds of legislative initiatives to craft model bills, there are educational initiatives to spread the Christian nationalist narrative. There's all kinds of data mining operations to hook up with conservative church networks to turn out the vote, and those are some of the areas where we'll be continuing to write about.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Your remarks about this group that is trying to recruit pastors and ministers to run for office reminded me of a passage in Alexis de Tocqueville's work, Democracy in America, where he's describing the relationship of religion and the American system and American democracy. And one of the things he talks about is that across the board, and he's writing in the 1830s, across the board, Americans agree in the separation of church and state, that religion does its thing over here, politics does its thing over here, and no clergyman would ever dream of running for office or being involved in the warp and woof of politics in that sense. And this seems to be like an absolute rejection of that, sort of that understanding of the way in which religion and democracy related to one another. And I want to sort of jump off, and I think I want to ask this question to you both as scholars and as a journalist and public intellectuals and people who've sort of looked at this phenomenon on the sort of the grassroots level rather than just at the theoretical level. But there seems to be a kind of interesting tension between the two parts of this term, the Christian part and the nationalism part, right? That when we think of nationalism, we think of essentially a discourse of deciding who's in the group and who's outside the group, who's part of the nation, who's not part of the nation, and what can happen in that borderline. And Christianity, at least as it's often preached, is a universal religion, right? It makes universal claims about all of humanity. So there's an interesting maybe tension or problematic between these two ideas and what happens when they come together, which they have historically, not only in the American context, but in other contexts as well. But I was wondering maybe if you can reflect upon that tension and what you've seen as a journalist, as former practitioners, as people who have been reflecting on this issue historically as well.
Go ahead.
Okay. So I know you're going to know this in more detail off the top of your head, Jerome, than I will, but I think of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, 1630. John Winthrop talks about a city on a hill, but Cotton Mather also understands the Massachusetts Bay Colony to be, in ways, I think, envisions it in ways similar to what Yonat just talked about in terms of contemporary Christian nationalists, which is that it's a promised land, it's a new Israel, that the encounters with native tribes are ones where God is testing, the Christians to obey him, and they're being punished by way of these violent and unfriendly encounters with the native people. That extends, from there throughout American history in various ways and in various episodes. But I also think that it's a mistake, and I think this is something that I try to get across to my students quite often, and I do on my show quite often, is that there's an assumption that the teachings of Jesus are of a universal kingdom of God. And there's an assumption that can't be sort of morphed or transformed in ways that would somehow cause the Christian person to be, for instance, have a disfavorable view of immigrants or refugees. And I'll just point to one example, and I know some of you in the room will be familiar with this, unfortunately, but there's a book called The Case for Christian Nationalism that appeared just a couple of months ago. And it made quite a splash. It was published by a man named Stephen Wolfe. The publisher came from Doug Wilson's publishing house. Doug Wilson's a pastor in Moscow, Idaho, quite influential, so on and so forth. The point, though, for me with that book is the case for Christian nationalism, so the case for resolving the tension you're talking about, Jerome, was made by way of an argument that said, not God created us to love all people and a kingdom of God has no borders. The argument was, God called you to love those who are like you. Now, you should love everyone, but you should love those who are like you most. And the author of that book is not somebody who makes this argument in what we might think of as a crass or blunt manner. He does it using the words of Augustine and Aquinas, Calvin, other reformers, and all the way up to the present day. The argument would be that there is no tension because God has called us to love those who are most like us. And according to the author, that means for him, those who were born in this country, those who are of European descent, and those who are American. And even if there was no lapse, no original sin, if Genesis 3 goes a different way, the argument is, theologically, this is still how it would be. Humans would have formed nations and communities. They all would have had different cultures, different ways of life, different foods. And so God knew this would be sin or no sin, lapse or no lapse. Thus, this is how one should understand the human condition, and one should celebrate that. So nationalism is the embodiment of the kingdom of God, is the argument. Now you might say, well, that's a fringe book. Who cares? Well, when it appeared, it was in the top 100 on Amazon. So it was like, what, 10 million books on Amazon? So if you reach the top 100, I don't care who you are, that's a lot of books. It stayed in the top couple thousand for months, and it remains in the ether. And you see the seminarians and the pastors that Yonat is talking about who are running for office, reading that book as a way to kind of understand their position theologically. And so I think that's one example we might have that really resolves the tension in a certain way that I think is obviously quite troubling, but
Yeah, I think separation of church and state is reviled in certain Christian nationalist circles, and in fact, the legal theory has been decimated by the Supreme Court as well, by this Supreme Court. I think there's a sense that if you separate church and state, that secularism will win out or win the day, and there's not a sufficient understanding that actually secularism is what allows freedom of religion and is kind of guarantees it in some ways. And I think that Americans have just, a lot of Christians have, you'll hear Lauren Boebert say that, what did she say? That I don't believe in this separation, or this separation of separation of church and state crap, or what did she call it, or something like that. It's just, I don't think that there's I would say that the fear of secularism has led people to fear this separation rather than celebrate it as the thing that guarantees that various religions in the United States can have can thrive.
I want to, I guess, follow up on sort of both of your answers. That, Brad, you mentioned Stephen Wolf's Case for Christian Nationalism and it being published by Doug Wilson out in Moscow, Idaho. And the interesting thing about Doug Wilson, Moscow, Idaho, is this attempt to get out of this problem of American pluralism by essentially creating a kind of intentional Christian community where troublesome things like the separation of church and state no longer exist, at least on that local level. I know that, Brad, at the end of your book, you actually, your trajectory kind of leads to people creating or joining these communities. And I'm wondering from what you've seen, both of you, what you've seen on the ground, what is the plausibility of this answer as one way in which Christian nationalism becomes manifest in contemporary America?
The plausibility? Say more.
I'm going to let you say more. I'm going to let Brad say more.
Okay. So one of the things that fascinates me is that I come from Southern California, and what I've noticed over the last decade or so is Southern Californians are moving all over the country. And if you're from Austin or Portland or Denver, you're pretty tired of that, I know. But one of the places that during the pandemic especially, but even before then, that Californians moved was Idaho. And so this led to a bunch of questions. As somebody trying to figure out the landscape of where he grew up, the question was, well, why Idaho? And it really relates to what Jerome just talked about with there are people who are congregating in what is known as the American Redoubt. So this is the region comprising Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, Eastern Washington, Eastern Oregon, who see themselves as Christian separatists. So if we're talking about migration and belonging, one of the answers that they have given and they are trying out, in essence, is to create a Christian separatist culture in a part of the country that is not overly populated, where land is abundant, where they can find property to create their own homesteads and, in some cases, prepper communes and so on. And you might say, well, again, just like the book I mentioned, well, that's a fringe phenomenon. But it's not. And local journalists in Idaho have been on this beat forever. But I talk about in my book the fact that you have Redoubt realtors, people who are helping Californians and Seattleites and Sacramento folks move to the American Redoubt and find homes. You have American Redoubt churches. And the pandemic supersized this. And I know that we'll be talking about this for a long time, but I think for decades to come, we'll be coming to grips with how the pandemic revolutionized American religion. And I think one of the ways it did that was migration patterns. And so in 2018, 80,000 Californians leave California for Idaho alone. That number continues to rise during the pandemic. Boise's the fastest growing metro west of the Mississippi. It'll have 1 million people in a couple of years. It's bigger than San Francisco. What's the point? The point is, I don't know if that's plausible, but it feels like it to a lot of people. They're definitely giving it the best shot they can, in essence, to create a kind of Christian separatist society. And the last thing I'll say about this is, when you look at the folks who are taking this journey, they're taking the migration from Anaheim or Sacramento or Seattle or anywhere else to say Moscow or Sandpoint or Eagle, Idaho. There are not many of them, and not all, but many of them are doing so not to say, well, we just, we wanted a nice suburban place to live with our kids and more gun rights and less vaccines and all that. That's definitely on their mind. But they're also doing so with the intention of, in ways that you talked about with the pastors in North Carolina, running for office, shaping public spaces, shaping their city and county boards and offices. They want to have an active role, not a passive role or a neutral role. I often say that we're hearing a lot about debates regarding libraries. Why are certain books in our libraries? Christian nationalists and others ask. In some cases in Idaho, the question is not why are these books in our library? The question is, why do we have a library? Why are we paying this librarian this much money and paying for this building every year? We don't need that. These books don't help our people become more Christian. We don't need to pay tax dollars into this institution. Who needs this? And so that's one example of many, but I think it illustrates the kind of experiment that's happening. And whether it's plausible or not, I don't know. But I do know for millions of people it feels like it at the moment at least. And for them, it feels like a last resort. Because they really feel, and this is why my book is called Preparing for War, they really feel like there's a coming civil war and there's a coming collapse of the United States.
Yeah, I don't know what to think of that. I mean, we heard recently from Marjorie Taylor Greene, who called for a kind of secession or a divorce, maybe a civil war between red states and blue states. But the fact is that Americans have been are just too enmeshed in each other to cleanly separate themselves out, right? The cities may be blue, but they're surrounded by red counties, and so I don't know what the success of these separatist movements will ultimately be. I live in North Carolina. I live in what's called the Triangle, which is this region of Raleigh, Durham, and Chapel Hill. They're both, it's a hugely democratic region. But you go 50 miles outside of it, and it's all red territory. And there certainly are efforts at separatism, and you see this not only in the Redoubt, but in other areas. I just read a story, and this is maybe a subject of a story that I'm looking into right now, and there's a county in Michigan around Grand Rapids called Ottawa County, where they elected a bunch of Christian nationalists to public office. I'm not sure how successful ultimately these efforts are at creating these separatist regions. It'll be interesting to see, and we'll see.
I was thinking that there was a very successful, for a time, attempt at a separatist Christian community in Utah.
Yeah, that's right.
right? With the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And what is interesting about that story is how when that experiment collapsed because of the weight of the federal government, the Mormon community became, within a generation, hyper-patriotic Americans. And created, sort of flipped a kind of Mormon nationalism to an American Mormon nationalism, if it were. So there's an interesting historical case to consider as we go forward. But it seems that the other side of this is the attempt of Christian nationalists to put their particular political preferences in play in the United States as it is, right? Through elections, through the democratic process, or through the courts, or through non-democratic means. And as a way to sort of get into that question, I thought maybe we'd open up to the audience.
Well, I guess foundationally, it was not created as a Christian nation, right? It was created as a nation of immigrants. The Constitution does not, has people running for office. There's no test, there's no religious test for people running for office. And it doesn't, so on a foundational basis, it's just not how the country was set up, and it doesn't. And declaring it a Christian nation would immediately beg the question of whether people who are not Christian are second-class citizens, right? Or what is their relationship? How can equality be guaranteed to them?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of reasons to state in terms of this argument. We only have a few minutes, so there's no way I can state them all. But I think there's, to Yonat's point, the country was envisioned as one in which the church and the state were separate. And I think about Martin Luther King Jr. and the mountaintop speech, his very last speech before he was assassinated in Memphis. And he talks about the freedom to gather and to protest. And one of the things he says, and this is in the late 1960s, is that if I were living in Soviet Russia or communist China and I did not expect those rights, then maybe I wouldn't be standing here. And I don't know if that's true or not. That's a hypothetical, and he said it. But he says, over here, I was promised those things. And once you promise me those things are things I'm going to fight for and believe in, whether I am black or white, whether I'm an immigrant, whether I'm a Christian person or not. And to dovetail on that, this country is no longer majority white Christian, and it will no longer be majority Christian in a very few years. And so to somehow say that the country is a Christian nation, historically, I think Yonat has made the point that there's a lot of problems with that argument. To say that you can have a democracy that is based on one religious identity, I think makes no sense. So to have democracy in the case you're making, I think would be impossible. But just de facto, the country is a country that is wildly diverse, with the largest population of religious people being those of no religious affiliation at all.
Right.
And so to follow through with the case you're making would be to completely ignore not only the historical precedents, the concerns about democracy, but also the de facto identities of Americans in 2023.
Thank you. With regard to the discussion of Stephen Wolfe, whom I hadn't studied, that made me think about someone who's a tenured professor across town, Chad Pecknold, and his group of Catholics promoting integralism, which is their equivalent on the Catholic side of Christian nationalism. I noticed that there's not a lot of overt interaction between what they do and what Stephen Wolfe does, but they certainly seem to be peas from the same pod. As a refugee from the GOP-centric Catholicism, I myself have come to realize that my own pro-life sympathies for the unborn were manipulated by people who for many years have sought to make Catholicism in the United States coterminous with the GOP agenda. Although I realize that there are some people who think of the pro-life movement as just bans on women's bodies, trying to control women's bodies, it seems to me that there are well-moneyed people who are in organizations who are using both integralism and the Protestant Christian nationalism not to control women's bodies, but to use very deep-seated desires among people to have a world that they can explain and that is structured and safe with nuclear families. And so, these are people who themselves don't really care about life, because if they did, they would be anti-death penalty and not merely pro-unborn life. These are people who care about exploiting people's desire for safety and security for their own ends. And I was wondering if you might have anything to say about larger forces with regard to moneyed people. I'm Jewish, so I'm certainly not trying to use any kind of dog whistles as far as religions or anything like that. But just the efforts to manipulate people through values into voting GOP and making them think that that's truly Christian.
Brad, do you want to plug your book right now?
Oh, no, well, sure. I mean, the case I make in the book, just to follow what Jerome's saying there, is that there's a long history of this. So the book starts in 1960, in the 1960s, but the argument would be that in the 1960s, we have many movements that most of us in the room, I would hope, consider to be positive developments in American history. The Civil Rights Movement, Voting Rights Act, a Civil Rights Act, sweeping immigration reform, women's liberation movements, queer liberation, Stonewall, I can go on and on and on. The Loving case, we could talk for hours. The white Christian nationalists sees this as when they lost their country and when the social order lost its way. It's when chaos erupted, when women, when immigrants, when people of color, when black people, when mixed race people, when non-Christians all of a sudden had rights and representation in the public square that felt as if the privilege of being a white Christian had been toppled. And thus, there is a concerted and organized effort since then to do exactly what you're saying, and that is to regain control of the social order. And I think what we see in the last 6 or 7 years is an acceleration of that to the point, I mean, if we just talk about reproductive rights, we're in a place now where just in the past couple days, I read a story out of Texas where, going off of SB 8, there's a man who is suing not his ex-wife who ended a pregnancy, but the friends she texted who encouraged her to do so because her ex-husband was menacing to her. And the women who texted with her affirming her decision to end the pregnancy are being sued for $1 million as a result, in accordance with SB 8. What's the point? The desire for control, the desire for a social order that follows a certain hierarchical structure is very much part of the movement that we're discussing tonight, and I think that's that the idea you have, I think, is there, yeah, through and through.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add to.
I would just, you mentioned the Catholic integralists and the Christian nationalists, and there's a time that these two people affiliated with these ideologies can work together to achieve certain sort of political ends. But there's a time when their comprehensive visions of the good are going to come into conflict with one another. There's been an attempt for them to work together in the past couple of years. There's been interesting journalism done on the National Conservatism conventions, which tried to create a fusion of people belonging to these groups. But in the end, they have a different understanding of what the sort of spiritual polity would look like in the end. And it's worth kind of considering that the Christian nationalists, and the reason why, we have the separation of church and state in this country is not all Christians believe the same thing, right? And often, a way to get out of the conflicts of religious conflicts within the Christian tradition itself is to essentially lower the stakes of political life.
Thanks both for a great panel. I want to keep it short because I know we're at time. And I want to laser in on immigration as of, because that was kind of like one of the original focuses of the panel. So I guess two threads. Could you talk a little bit about the dynamic of which Christian nationalists come from or descended from immigrants to this country, through the Second Great Migration and all that, and what role Christianity played in their integration into American social life? And then secondly, could you talk about the changing patterns in migration that we see today, where, given that most of our migrants are coming from Latin America, heavily Catholic, but also extremely a growing evangelical Protestant community, could you talk about the tension there and conceptions of whiteness around being Latino and immigrating to this country? I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff to get into. So if you want to do that in 2 minutes, that'd be awesome. But thank you both.
Yeah. Immigration has become a huge flashpoint, and the Republican Party has, in particular, strayed from the time of George W. Bush, who actually wanted to find some kind of solution to our immigration crisis. And today, there's no way that Republicans are looking for a way to solve that. I think it's basically a fear that the people who came to this country were for the most part Christian. They came from Europe. They came from Nordic countries that already practiced Christianity. And the rest, and today we see immigration coming from Asia and from Africa and from South America, and some of them are not bringing in Christianity, or in some cases they are, not always. This is creating huge tensions.
So I would just add that the story, all these stories are more complicated than we can do justice to this evening. I read the statistics from the PRRI survey that show how, on the whole, white Christian nationalists are opposed to immigration in ways that their counterparts are not. However, and my colleague Matt Taylor, who's here tonight, has done really great work on this to show, among others, that there are ways that newly arrived immigrants who have who are coming to the country as part of perhaps either Latino Catholic or Latino evangelical / Pentecostal communities are finding their way into Christian nationalist spaces. And my argument would be, and I'm happy to elaborate this and talk about it further later, but you can think, well, how does that work, right? If immigration and the Christianity you're talking about are seemingly opposed, how is it you could sort of attract, invite, and integrate, and those integrate is the words that would be used in that context, not mine, those folks into your spaces and communities? My argument would be that patriarchy is a hell of a drug, right? Okay, and so patriarchy is a great way, and using the rhetoric of family values, of gender and sexuality and patriarchy is a wonderful way to outstrip the concerns about immigration. And so to me, that's where there's really interesting conversations to be had, and why every time an election comes and we have the same old story on CNN or anywhere else about how Democrats are counting on Latinx voters, the numbers show something different. And I think that's for me where I'm interested in thinking about this. Yeah.
We have literally 3 minutes left. So I'm going to ask that we have 3 people waiting at the microphone. If you could just very quickly sort of throw out your question, and then I'll let Yonat and Brad have their final say.
So sorry for the long question, so feel free to say thank you next. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the relationship Christian nationalists have with secularism. Specifically, my teacher makes the argument separationism has been dead since 85, Wallace versus Jaffrey, and the dissent of Justice Rehnquist. And so I was wondering if, secularists in this country decided to take more of an accommodationist route, the government supports all religions, would the Christian nationalist base kind of be more opposed to that, less opposed to that? Do you think this would be we would see a renewed growth? How dare the government support these other religions? Or would there somewhat be a mellowing that, there's now a renewal of this Christian privilege, even though it's now shared across a couple other traditions as well?
Hi, thank you so much for having this conversation, and I'm going to keep it very short. I had a whole long question, but I know we're running out of time, but I think this audience I would like to present this thought before the audience here. So I'm from India, and I've covered the rise of Hindu nationalism since 2014, and I find striking parallels between our conversation here about white Christian nationalism and what I have encountered with Hindu nationalists in India. At the very heart of it, they believe in the idea of a Hindu nation, which includes present-day Afghanistan, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and all of that. They have a common enemy, the otherization of other minority groups as the enemy of the state. A faction of them also believe in the Great Replacement theory, their own version of it. They're anti-queer, patriarchal, misogynist, and all of that. So how is it, and I find it very fascinating, that a white Christian nationalist in, in Florida, and a Hindu nationalist in Uttar Pradesh in India, they're so far apart from each other in every possible way, but at the very core of it, they have the same ideology, and they believe in the same thing, and their tactics are also strikingly similar.
Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Christian Watkins with Network Lobby for Catholic Social Justice. Brad, thank you for the reference to Martin Luther King asking for America to live up to what it says on paper. What's the call to action here? What is the best hope for us to move from the intellectual to the practical in subverting and overcoming the progression of white nationalism? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so guys, in a minute or less, secularism, sort of the universality of religious nationalisms, and what is to be done.
That's a tall order. I guess, one thing that comes to mind is I recently wrote a story about Jewish groups that are suing over abortion. And what they've done is they've taken a tactics, the decline of the fall of Roe v. Wade. And what they're trying to do is to use religious freedom to argue that the Supreme Court ruling in Dobbs basically is a Christian view of when life begins, and that violates their religious freedom as Jews who do not believe that life begins at conception. So maybe one way is just to adopt the tactics of the Christian right and to argue for a more diverse or a less religious understanding of our civic life.
So I would say first question on universality and all religions, the answer on the whole is no. It's either Christian privilege or burn it down. Now, that's on the whole. We can find exceptions to that. But Judeo-Christian to me is a absurd term. Christian nationalists will drop the Judeo anytime they need to. Anyway, I'll stop there. We have 1 minute. Okay, so answer is no. I think second question, I think about Perry and Gorski in The Flag and the Cross talk about Christian nationalism being based on order, freedom, and violence. If the white Christian can control the social order, they will be free. And if they can't, they will use violence to do so, and then they will be free. And I think that to me is a great place to have a comparison point between other forms of religious nationalism. Social order leads to one group being free, and if that social order is disrupted, use violence to fix it, and then you'll be free again. Third question, the need for me in my work is for us to realize that Christian nationalists for a long time, but the 60 years I trace in my book, have been involved in ways that UNAT has talked about and reported on at every level of American society. So that's not the White House, that's not the Senate, that's not who's in the Capitol just across town. That's every ligament, tendon, muscle of the American body. So I recently gave a talk in a small town in Central California, and somebody there ran for school board because she was convinced that CRT was a raging problem in the school system in this very rural county where most people live in farmland. So she ran on that platform, proudly anti-CRT, Christian nationalist, and who was her opponent? No one, ran unopposed, right? She does not have kids in the school system, has never been part of education, and yet now she's making decisions on that school board. That's one out of 100,000 examples in this country of how school board, comptroller, county supervisor, mayor, any position of power you can imagine, from Boise to Tampa, from Albany to Albuquerque, Christian nationalists are saying we will run there and we will gain control and influence there. So I think on a civic level, the answer is realize the situation we're in, and realize that that situation is very real. And if you think it's hyperbole or you think we're exaggerating, there's great books out there. There's one for sale in the lobby out front that I think will show you that it's not hyperbole, and that's one way that we can think about this. I would encourage everyone, what I do, and I probably don't need to tell this audience this, but we're like 2.5 months into 2023. What's one area of this social body that you might get involved in that you have not been before? Is it reproductive rights? Is it voting rights? Is it immigration? Is it something else? Where will you give your time to make sure that the Christian nationalists don't take away the chance for American democracy?
Okay.
That's a good
That's a
segue to go
good
get
start.
wine, don't you think?
That's
like a really good segue for a glass of wine, I think.
And Brad
Yeah.
actually stole my thunder. I was going to thank you all for coming and to remind you that there is a reception outside the hall, so you should grab a glass of wine or beer or sparkling water if you'd like, and we'll have an opportunity to chat. And thank you all so much for coming out, and thank you, Brad and Anat, for your presentations and for your conversation. And I look forward to talking more about this. Thank you.